The first thing Mara noticed was the silence. The morning air on the coast had always been musical. Gulls calling, waves breathing under the pier, the tinny clink of buoys against rope. But that November dawn felt muffled, as if someone had turned down the world's volume. She walked the sand with her hands tucked into the pockets of a worn coat that had once been too expensive for her budget and now felt like armor. The town of Greyhaven had always been small and stubborn, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's grandparents. It had been home for her whole life. The gulls on the roof, the harbor that tasted of salt and diesel, the way storms came through like theatrical actors, loud and then gone. But she hadn't expected to be here alone at 34, raising a son who had known a father's presence more as a memory than a routine. A year and a half had passed since the divorce. Jobs had come and gone. A seasonal position at the fish market, a string of shifts at the Marina's cafe, odd jobs pinched between school pickups. What had remained constant was the cost of existing. Rent, heating, the quiet accumulation of small expenses that weighed more than any one bill. Her son, Jonah, was 7, a lanky kid who loved drawing boats and could name every species of shell on the beach. He slept with a flashlight and an illustrated book of marine creatures, convinced the world was full of secret things. Mom? Jonah had asked one night as they sat at the small kitchen table, light from a single lamp pooling like a halo around their plates. Do you ever miss Dad? His voice had been tentative, the way a child tests a weathered plank. Mara had looked at him, measuring what would be honest and what would be too heavy. Sometimes, she said, soft as the nap, but we have each other, and that's what matters. She had meant it. But what mattered didn't pay the landlord. What mattered did not fix a leaky roof or replace a gas-guzzling car. What mattered was not a bank account with a comforting number in it. The idea came to her like driftwood, a rumor from an old man who spent his mornings on a bench near the pier, shelling peas and watching the horizon. He spoke in slow, clipped phrases, the kind of man who kept things in his pockets because he believed everything had use. There's a thing washed ashore, he said one morning, staring at the sea. Haven't seen it before. Folks say it's an old chest. A lot of folk bring home nothing. Sometimes the ocean gives a present. At first, she dismissed it. The town had its share of tall tales. But curiosity is a small creature that grows in empty rooms. After 2 weeks of skip lunches and extra shifts turning into a paltry safety net, Mara found herself walking the beach at dawn, with Jonah in his pajamas and a thermos of warm milk tucked under his arm. They scoured the high tide line where plastic bottles and tangled seaweed gathered like offers. It took the third morning to find it. It was not a neat chest like the ones from storybooks, but a clumsy, barnacled box of wood, straps corroded with salt, the lid swollen with water. It had washed up near the jetty as if an old secret had finally surrendered. Jonah's eyes went wide. He crouched, running small fingers along the barnacle rims. Do you think it's treasure? He whispered. Mara laughed, because that's what adults do to keep the sound of fear from cracking through. They hauled it to the sand together, the wood scratching and scuffing. With a pry bar borrowed from a neighbor and a stubborn determination, Mara eased the lid open. Inside there were objects that smelled faintly of sea and oil, a coil of rope, a battered brass compass fogged with years, a leather journal whose edges had softened like a well-read face. There was a small carved figure of a whale, a handful of tin fishing lures, and something wrapped in oilcloth. It was the journal that snagged her attention. The leather cover bore a name pressed into it, Elias Hargrove. Mara remembered the name from the harbor's older stories. Elias had been a line skipper once, a man who knew the Gulf in a way that seemed almost sacred. He disappeared from town 30 years ago, the consequence of a storm that men still spoke of in the corner of bars and under breath-muted prayers. She hesitated, then untied the oilcloth. Inside lay a stack of brittle pages and a small bundle of sea maps with handwritten notes. She sat down in the sand and read. The journal was a litany of days at sea, rope burns and salted mornings, the way certain currents carried schools of fish in predictable arcs, the way gulls behaved when a storm was near. But mixed into the navigation were other entries, practical, stubborn, and wise, about where to find a certain kind of clam that cleaned well on those days when the market paid nothing, how to mend a net with a single thread, what bait commanded a reluctant catch when hands were tired. On the final pages, someone had scrawled a list of small things: names of nets, a recipe for making a curative broth out of fish heads, and local herbs, even a method for brining fish that made market buyers pay attention. Mara felt something like a compass in her chest click. The journal was more than a relic. It was a manual of survival written by a man who'd lived and learned from the sea. It came with a voice, precise, dry, without pretense, that could teach her something the internet could not. She folded the pages back and looked at Jonah. "We could try," she said. The words were simple, but they felt enormous. They walked home, dragging the chest through the sand, the weight of it making them feel both absurd and oddly hopeful. Back in her small kitchen, they cleaned the journal's pages and spread the maps across the table. Jonah traced the routes with a finger. "It's like a treasure map," he said. "But for fish." Mara laughed then, not from humor, but from the way the future suddenly looked less like a cliff and more like a path. If the market wouldn't provide work, maybe the sea still would. If the town's docks held memory, perhaps they held opportunity too. She did the thing you can do when your back is against the tide. She planned. Night after night, Mara pored over Elias's notes. She made lists, currency of intention. She counted what she had: a dingy but seaworthy skiff owned by her late uncle, a pair of sea boots with one sole worn thin, the lingering network of fishermen who remembered her family. She had hands that knew ropes and a stomach for early mornings. She had Jonah, and for him, she swore to try everything. The first step took all she had. She sold a piece of jewelry that had been her mother's and traded the money for bait and a stack of ice boxes. She asked around the docks, humbly and with a bit of fear, if anyone would take her out. Old Tobias, who ran the small repair shop by the pier, raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" he asked. She was, in her way, both reckless and precise. She told him about the journal, and he sighed, thinking of old men and storms. But he nodded and loaned her a new oar. On the morning they launched, Jonah came with a thermos and a bag of sandwiches packed by Mara's careful hands. The sea was a sheet of pewter, small waves folding gently, gulls circling with lazy certitude. The skiff rocked as Mara pushed off. She felt the old muscle memory in her arms, the small, delicate choreography of handling a boat. Elias's maps were clumsy at first. Some currents had moved. The sea kept its own counsel. But there were lessons between the lines. Watch the wind's shadow. Look at the color of the water for promise. Use the morning light to read where fish might be. Their first day out was modest. A few mackerel, a small basket of crab. It was not the silvering catch of dreamers, but it fed the table, warmed the pockets with a small wedge of coin. Jonah counted the small earnings with the solemnity of a boy who had learned the value of a buck. The real prize, Mara thought, as they rode home under a sky that bled pink, was the sense that they were not entirely at the mercy of a shaky economy. The sea had not abandoned them. It had simply been waiting for someone to ask. But the harbor is a place of community and rumor. Finding the chest had set things whispering. The next morning, old women in the market shook hands with Mara with new interest. A man who ran a small fish stall offered her a few quick tips. And yet, not all attention was kind. There were eyes that measured and judged. "You can't live off that," a neighbor had said bluntly. "Better to take what you can in town work." The old prejudices, single mother, undercapitalized, dreamer, were heavy. Mara tucked the journal under her arm like a talisman and returned to work. The ocean had given her something, yes, but it didn't promise easy days. It offered a harder thing: the possibility of work done with her hands, the teaching of a craft that could perhaps grow into more than what her ex had left behind. She slept less, rose more, and cooked meals with a new focus. Each small success, a market sale, a nod from a passing fisherman, the way Jonah announced proudly that she had made the best clam broth ever, was a stone laid across the water, a path to cross. Word of Mara's small catches moved through Greyhaven in the way news does in tight towns, by way of coffee cups and small talk, in quick nods and sideways glances that carry entire sentences. The first few weeks were still mean on the ledger. A storm took their docked skiff's temporary shelter. A pulley snapped and cost far more than she expected to fix. She slept next to tools sometimes, dreaming in short, pragmatic bursts. But she also found the rhythm of the trade. The journal shaped the way she approached the sea. Elias's notes were less about big hauls and more about thrift and craft. Where to set a simple trap for lobster on a week when winds were wrong, how to make a brine that preserved fish for longer, which ice packed in straw kept fillets fresher than cheap chipboard. The journal taught her to think like someone who preserved value, not only caught it. Mara began to create small offerings: fish brined with lemon and seaweed, clam broth simmered until it tasted like lullabies, smoked mackerel tucked into bread with two herbs that made the whole town remember summer. Jonah, who at school was quiet and quick to disappear into the margins, blossomed in the margins of this life. He learned to muffle nets for the market and to keep small sales in neat piles. He learned to take the change and hide it in his sock like treasure. At first, market customers only offered polite smiles. But those who tasted came back the following week. One woman, Maribel, who ran the local diner, took Mara aside and said, "You got something honest here. Keep doing it." Maribel's approval was currency in Greyhaven. With the modest profits, Mara bought a battered old smoker and started to teach herself smoking by watching the way the smoke curled and the way heat slowed time. She learned to string 2 lines of garum in the coziest way, to hold back salt until you could taste the sea, not drown it. The food sold not because it was flashy, but because it was steady and strangely comforting. People in small towns have old nerves. They want familiar things that feel right. Mara's food did that. The old prejudices, though, didn't disappear. When a younger, slicker vendor began setting up not far from her stall and selling fast, bright seafood wraps at a bargain, some questioned her methods. Why pay more for hers? Asked an older man who'd once voted for her to be given a chance. It stung. Not the money, but the memory. Her ex calling her inefficient, her choices sentimental. She met competition in other forms too. A storm one week ruined her nets. A health inspector visited after a neighbor's complaint about the smell and inspected every crevice. The inspection passed, but it took its toll on her nerves. She could fix things, but she couldn't fix the way some folks measured value by polish and not by sweat. There were moments when desperation reared up like a wave. One cold afternoon, with winter cramping the market and her freezer humming emptily, Mara stood in front of the closed doors of the Harbor Cooperative and debated the cost of a bus ticket to a city where temp work paid more. Her hands shook with the choice: stay and build slowly, or leave and pay rent with a paycheck that could be delivered without risk. Jonah found her that day and peered at her with a solemnity beyond his years. "Don't leave," he said simply. "I don't want to live in a hotel again." She could have wept openly then. Instead, she wrenched herself upright and went home to make a plan. She could not trade the small flame of something beginning for the steady glow of anonymity. She had promised Jonah not to let fear decide. The small victories kept coming. A regional food aggregator reached out after a feature in a small magazine. They requested a sample and published a brief column praising her sea-smart approach. An invitation came to participate in a community festival on the pier, a chance to serve under better lights in a place where tourists might find them. Mara took the invitation as a gamble that mattered. Preparation pushed her to new levels of craft. She planned, tested, and iterated recipes, assembling a menu that balanced curiosity and comfort. With Jonah's help, she labeled jars and wrapped smoked fish in waxed paper with a tidy, handwritten sticker: Mara's Shore Smoke. The festival was a crucible: long hours, sudden demand, and the need to keep the quality steady. She borrowed a generator and a folding table, and wore a borrowed apron patched with a child's marker doodle for luck. On the festival day, the pier thrummed with laughter and the lights of stall lanterns. Tourists milled between vendors, drawn to scents that promised novelty. Her stall quickly developed a line. A local food influencer filmed a quick clip praising the texture of the smoked mackerel and the clarity of the clam broth. Lines formed, phones were out, and Jonah grinned at the bustle. But the sea, like fate, keeps its surprises. Halfway through the festival, a storm blew in faster than forecasts had suggested. Winds came across the pier with a sudden anger, folding tents and sending napkins into the water. Vendors scrambled, the generator hiccuped, someone's grill sent a flare of panic through the crowd. Mara clutched platters and moved with practiced calm. She ensured her jars were secure and her pots were stable. In the end, they closed early, damp and windblown, but they had sold out. The festival had given Mara more than money. It had given her a reputation. Backstage, a man with a conservative blazer and a patient smile approached her. He introduced himself as Cedric, who ran a small local restaurant that catered to oyster crowds. "You have integrity in your food," he said. "I'd like to speak to you about selling a weekly batch to my place." Opportunity began to ripple in subtle ways. The extra income smoothed some edges. Debts were paid a week earlier. The oil-stained coats were replaced. Jonah could finally afford a new pair of shoes without Mara spending nights calculating the cost across the month. She let herself breathe. Yet with the good came a new pressure she hadn't anticipated. Regular orders required consistency. Cedric's restaurant demanded a steady supply of smoked fish and clam stock, and he expected it on schedule. That meant longer days, careful inventory, and the risk of failing a week and losing the contract. The safety of steady work walked a thin line with the fragility of a one-person operation. But Mara adapted. She mapped a schedule, optimized the smoker, and traded time for reliability. She learned to buy in bulk when prices dipped, to dry certain herbs that kept their flavor, and to set aside cash for rainy weeks. It was not glamorous. It was the kind of boring competence that grows quietly when someone refuses to give up. Her name became associated with something beyond food: resilience. Townspeople began telling the story of the woman who had pulled a chest from the sea and turned its paper into a living thing. Children at school boasted that Jonah's mom made the best clam broth. The narrative of the ocean's gift settled into the town like an honest rumor, sometimes exaggerated, often true, and always talked about at markets. Still, every business expands trouble in proportion to profit. A large wholesale buyer came through one spring and offered to buy in bulk at a price that would have made every month manageable. It was tempting, a fast route to stability. But the buyer's terms demanded scaling in a way that would require Mara to compromise on methods: faster smoking, different brining that relied on additives, use of flash-frozen imports to guarantee supply. It smelled, to Mara, of something not quite like what she'd started. She slept on it, and at dawn, Jonah found a pile of her to-do lists scattered across the kitchen table. "Are you going to sell to the big buyer?" he asked, eyes serious. Mara looked at him and felt the ledger in her mind, the payments made, and the dreams kept. "Not like that," she said finally. "We keep what makes us ours." It was a choice that would slow growth, but keep integrity. The buyer moved on, and Mara continued, smaller but steadier. The years that follow in stories like this are often compressed: months into sentences, trials into paragraphs. For Mara, the compression felt like an accordion. There were long, breathless currents and sudden squeezes of pressure. One autumn, a regional magazine picked up her story, pairing it with a large, glossy photograph of a jar of smoked mackerel glinting like a small moon. The piece called her crafts coastal alchemy, and overnight, an unusual audience hovered at the fringe of Greyhaven's next market day. People arrived with cameras and curiosity, eager to taste a product that had been made almost as a protest against leaving. Orders came from 2 nearby towns, and a boutique grocer reached out about a seasonal shelf. Success, as it tends to do, brought a different kind of complexity. With demand came the need to keep systems. Mara hired a part-time helper, a young man named Finn who'd been a deckhand and wanted to learn about the smoking trade. He was quick and honest, and after a slow start, proved trustworthy. Jonah, too, had a role, a small clerk who boxed jars and learned to make change. The family business vocabulary sits oddly in the mouths of kids, but Jonah learned the cadence quickly. He learned patience. Yet the pressure came when the harbor's economy shifted. A large industrial operation proposed expansion near the mouth of the bay, promising jobs, but also threatening the delicate ecosystem that sustained the local fisheries. The town argued and rallied. Mara found herself at meetings she had never imagined attending, a voice among many. The new factory promised stable wages, but also the risk of decimating the catch she relied on. People who had once simply nodded now split into camps. Mara found her voice in those meetings. She spoke about small business, about the language of tides that could not be hurried, about the taste of clams that told of clean water. "The sea is not an ATM," she said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "It's an entire community." Her words were not enough to stop industry alone, but they nudged conversations towards sustainability. Allies joined: fishermen who had once dismissed her work, youth who wanted a future on their coast, even the diner owner Maribel, who had long ago bought one of her jars and learned to taste difference. In the midst of political storms, business continued. Mara balanced deliveries with the civic work, and the stress sometimes left her raw. There were nights when her hands shook from exhaustion, and other nights when she woke with a fresh idea for a brine that tasted like summer in a jar. The work of making food became intertwined with the work of keeping a place livable. One winter, the storm came violent. It chewed at the coast for days, tearing at the jetties and flooding low markets. The pier's planks were splintered, and several small boats were lost. Mara's smoker shed was soaked. Jars cracked in the cold because their lids weakened in the salt wind. The loss was a gut punch. For a week, they ate from thin cupboards and kept the children warm with borrowed blankets. But the community responded, as an old net responds when patched. Neighbors came with hands, with generators, with offers to help. Cedric, the restaurateur who had once offered a contract, closed his dining room for a day and opened as a community soup kitchen. Mara worked at his side, bowls moving from kitchen to table, laughter threading through the solemnity of shared loss. In that wearied, holy time, she felt gratitude like a tide. Recovery was slow but honest. They salvaged doors, bought wood with pooled donations, and patched roofs. Mara's jars returned in small batches to the market, and people bought them not only for taste, but to help keep the work alive. Jonah, who had started as a boy with a treasure map, now spoke to other kids about measuring salt and patience. He could name crustaceans and map tides. He had a steadiness in his eyes that came from having had to learn in the middle of difficulties. Years later, Mara would stand at the edge of the same jetty and think about the day she found the chest. The town had changed. She had changed. The business had grown, not into a big brand, but into a sturdy local presence. A small storefront where jars lined shelves alongside local honey and hand-knitted scarves. They called it Shoreline Provisions, and it smelled of cedar and smoke and lemon. Elias's journal was framed in the shop, a weathered relic with ink that had bled. She placed it behind glass as a daily reminder that knowledge and craft are gifts you honor by sharing. Jonah had a job title, assistant manager, though he disliked the sound of the word, and a small notebook of his own where he mapped tides and recorded customers' favorite meals. He sometimes stood at the counter telling tourists how the town had survived storms and how the sea still kept its lessons. Mara married the routine she had fought for with compassion. She continued to show up at town meetings, imploring for harbor protection and for small business support. She taught a class at the community center about whatever she had learned: smoking, brining, the art of listening to a weather pattern. People came to learn and stayed to talk. The kitchen became a place of memory and instruction. If there is a moral in this kind of story, Mara's is a quiet one. Survival is a craft. It needs tools and stubbornness and a willingness to learn from whatever the world offers you, be it a ruined chest or a cracked map. The most mundane things can become scaffolding for a life rebuilt. A skiff, a journal, a child's steady hands at your side. On the morning Jonah turned 12, Mara packed him a sandwich wrapped in waxed paper with a sticker that read Shoreline Provisions, made with salt and grit. They ate by the shore, the same shore where the chest had come ashore years ago. Jonah tossed a stone, watched the ripples, then smiled. "You ever wish Dad had been different?" he asked, voice casual as the tide. Mara took a breath, feeling the years like layered driftwood. She thought of the small, brave decisions that had led her here: a sold necklace, a journal unearthed, a choice to stay. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but I don't wish my life away. I like where we are." Jonah nodded and looked out at the sun lifting over the sea. He had learned one of the oldest lessons the ocean keeps: that things arrive and leave, and you learn to keep the ones that make you better. A gull cried overhead, and Mara let the sound settle. The chest they had found was a beginning, not a miracle. The miracle, if there was one, was the steady work of making a life. Not perfect, not sudden, but real. She turned to Jonah, ruffled his hair, and for a moment the world felt exactly as it should. Honest, salt-tasting, and full of the small gifts the sea still offered to those who listened.